Hello everybody, I hope you're going to excuse me this a bit edgy title, but I know that on the internet the edge sells and I've gotta grow the channel, so come to me. I've got the edge. Share, like, subscribe. Anyhow, this video should really be called Cycling While Heavy, but regardless. Oh, and it is supposed to be recorded in the field as I'm riding my bike, with each section being recorded in a different place as I'm sharing my thoughts as I'm riding. But it has gotten warmer, it has gotten, well, much more pleasant outside, the weather has improved, so obviously every place is simply crawling with humans. And you know, humans. Ew. So I'm recording here. So, let me share you about my thoughts and my experiences with riding a bicycle or cycling while being heavier than average rider, because you might be having this notion as you are witnessing the sport that most of it is well, skinny men doing feats of endurance that are not available to us mere mortals, and people chasing weight. Obviously weight has some importance in cycling, and unfortunately, fortunately slash, it is a very important part of marketing of bicycle branded products. And of course, if you are heavier than average, well, you will be facing a little bit of a challenge when trying to select a bicycle that's not going to, well, fall apart under you. Moreover, the mere fact that you are heavier than usual will mean certain things. So in order to save you this unpleasant surprise when you are returning from your first ride, completely broken, both you and your bike, here are my observations about cycling while heavy. Now, and by the way, as I weighed myself today, I tipped the scale approximately 100 kilograms with a change, or approximately 220 pounds, and the maximum weight I ever was approximately 130 kilograms, so 300 pounds, give or take. Cycling by its very nature will require you to keep more or less the same position for an extended time, and obviously you are going to hammer the interface points of the bicycle, which is the handlebars, the saddle and the pedals, quite a bit. And of course, because of your increased weight, coupled to the fact that the interfaces, which is the handlebars, the saddle and the pedals, are more or less standard, means that you're going to be pushing quite a bit of pressure on the handlebars. What does it mean? First of all, if you don't have the conditioning, you're going to get tired pretty fast, you're going to feel quite a bit of discomfort in your hands. And two, if you are very unlucky, you might pinch some nerves in your palms, and that's going to be quite painful. In the extreme example, if you're going to do it for a long time, regardless of pain, you might end up with something called golfer's elbow, or golfer's wrist, or tennis wrist, whatever. Essentially, a constant inflammation of your joints. In order to somewhat mitigate the problem, I am using double wrapped handlebars, and I was always using very thick, very foamy, very soft grips, because, well, I learned quite quickly that I don't like to suffer more than I have to. Obviously, you're going to be sitting on a saddle, and because you are heavy and you are most likely a fairly standard sized person who bought a standard bike, you are going to attempt to fit yourself to a standard saddle, which means that you're going to be exerting 2-3 times the pressure of a normal person on a saddle. Moreover, because lighter people, especially conditioned lighter people, are using quite a bit of their strength by pushing on the pedals, they aren't really sitting on the saddle, they are merely hovering over it or sitting very lightly. You're not going to do it, which means it's going to cause quite a bit of discomfort for you. First of all, if you don't have proper saddle, you're going to suffer from saddle sores, not recommended, very painful. Second of all, you're going to get very fatigued and very hammered by using improper saddle. The way I handled this, when I bought my first bike, I replaced the saddle after a few rides, obviously, and being in quite a bit of pain. I bought a very thick, very big, almost cushion-like saddle. Or should I say couch-like saddle? Anyhow, a very big saddle, and I was riding that as long as I could, because it would spread the pressure of my abundance over larger area, so it was less painful. If you are a heavy rider, consider having wider saddles, because a wider saddle most likely is going to ameliorate and help you with the issues of riding on one of these. And by no means buy something that is hard and buy something that is racy and narrow, because unless you have the conditioning or you are very hard and have extreme willpower, you are going to suffer. I wonder how much in frame I'm going to be with this one, because I can't preview this. Anyhow, I'm going to tell you a story. When I first started riding, the most common defect of my bike would be broken spoke on the rear wheel. The problem is that most wheels, an overwhelming majority of wheels, unless they are built by some sort of masterful wheel builder who knows what they're doing, are built with straight gouge spokes on both sides and aren't really well tensioned. The problem being that because you are heavier than average, and by heavier I mean 50% heavier, you are going to be stress testing those wheels immediately. I think I was at the bike shop when I got my first bike. I don't know, in a week, in 2 weeks I would be constant corrections to the rear wheel. At some point I simply said, enough of this. I got myself 36 spoke wheels, tensioned them as hard as possible, and that didn't fix the issue. It made them just last for a little bit longer, but it was caused by simply fatigue. The difference in between spoke tension in the left and right side would cause problem eventually, so I got grown to it. However, a few years ago, when I was on a trip abroad with my kid, she was sitting in the seat that hangs over the rear wheel, and she was obviously being a child, so she was jumping around it, being interested in everything. And when we were on that trip, I broke 5 spokes within a matter of 2 days. And that was the time when I said, enough of this, I need to fix the issue. And this is the first wheel that lasts. What I did then was build the wheel first with 2.3 millimeters, so thicker than normal spokes, and then I did what I already alluded on the channel. I am routinely building my wheels on the drive with spokes on the drive side being thicker than the spokes on the other side. This equalizes the spoke tension and makes riding the bike less of a stress test. This wheel is 6 years old and no corrections was done to it. This is the first wheel of this kind I built, and I've been building my wheels like that ever since, and no problems whatsoever. But what I'm getting at, if you're going to get factory wheels of whatever brand and you are pushing 100 kilograms or more, you're going to have constant problems with rear wheels. Most likely you're going to be breaking spokes. Straight gouge, expensive wheels, God knows what, you're going to have issues with that, because those wheels are built for people or tested for people which are 60-70 kilograms. You are more than that. Most likely, maybe twice more than that. And if we're on the subject of rear wheels, another issue we're going to note is that all of my wheels have chromomolybdenum axles because I am a heavy guy. If I would use aluminum axles, they would break at some point. This is link in the description, the fabulous freewheel. I'm going to link the video with the detailed explanation. However, most wheels on the market are essentially magical freewheels. Shimano hubs, at least the older ones, the non-microspline, don't have this issue. They have other issue, which is the very little clutch mechanism, which is inside of the free hub, would simply be destroyed. I stopped having problems with clutches on rear wheels when I started using very high quality wheels, so XT or something above. If I would lose something of a lower quality, of a lower tier, like Asira or Tourney or what have you, I would be simply breaking them. So expect, if you have a lower quality wheels, you're going to be breaking the axles, you're going to be breaking the clutches, and while you can brute force yourself into some sort of higher quality standard when it comes to the rear hub, like for example Chris Kings, Industry 9s, what have you, something that is almost downhill specific. This might solve the issue, but the issue is that once again you are stress testing this component. This component has been designed for lighter people, and if you're going to hammer it, you're going to break it. I stopped having this issue when I started using very heavy hubs, very thick clutches, chromoly axles. So you might want to consider doing the same thing. See anything interesting? I boldly say this is a road bike, although many people disagree. But this is not road bike size. This is 44/30, which I adapted from a mountain crankset and a custom chainring of my own making. But that's irrelevant. This is a Campagnolo something front derailleur, and this is a road bike. However, because I'm not some sort of a perfectly fit young man who spends most of his time training, I'm an old fat guy, I can't really push high gears. Moreover, because I am heavy, I have much more inertia and I can have to do much more work in order to overcome something called gravity. And what does it mean? It means that if you are a heavy rider, you're going to be needing lower gears, especially if you want to climb hills. Now, I am a fairly seasoned rider, so 30 by 25, which is my bottom gear on this bike, is sufficient if I ride in a radius about 50 kilometers from my home, which is fine. However, if I would like to do some serious mountain riding on a road bike, this would be still 30, but I would most likely get 32 at the back, and that might give me the edge enough to push myself on the bigger climbs. Why? Because fighting with weight is fighting with gravity. Since you are not going to have your power proportional to your weight, you'll be going up slower. In order to ride slower, you'll have to use lower gearing. Essentially, the heavier you are, the lower gearing you're most likely going to need. There is a trend in the mountain bike world, and I think in road bikes, or maybe not, that's not really my thing, but to have flatter and flatter and flatter pedals. Unfortunately, these flatter and flatter and flatter pedals come with the cost of thinner and thinner and thinner pedal axles, which means that there is a very high probability, if you are going to be riding, especially if you're going to be riding hard on some sort of a mountain bike, you're going to be breaking pedals. It's a little bit of a black magic in order to find the correct pedal for you, but you want your axles to be thick, because that's a safety issue. Now, I don't know whether the titanium magic axles of pedals for $200 are going to sustain my weight, but I certainly don't look forward into pedal breaking off when I'm doing a power cycle. That would majorly suck. See anything interesting here? Well, I claim this is a road bike, but I am using an overbuilt wheel on an overbuilt rim and a 32mm tire. The reason might be, you already know what it is, and the reason, well, the core reason here is that I want more separation from the road, because if I would hit a square bump like a railroad track or something like that, because of my weight, on 25 or 28mm tire, I would be risking too much of getting a pinch flat. And well, patching pinch flat is pain in the posterior, regardless of the tire size, but doing this on a skinny road tube, that's suffering. And experience taught me that 28 on a rigid bike is too little for me. 32 is sufficient. I'm not having a problem with it as long as I keep my pressures above 70 psi or 80 psi. And a supplemental, if you are a heavier rider and you are dead set on riding 25mm or 23mm tires, because for example the frame you've got can't accept anything else, you have to be very diligent with your tire pressure and keep it at maximum value as long as possible before every ride, essentially, because if you drop below a certain critical value, which isn't really low, at least not as low as for average rider, you're going to be catching pinch flats, and that's not class. And by the way, since we are on the topic of rubber, I think it goes without saying that you're going to be wearing your tires, especially your rear tire, quite faster than your lighter friends. Sorry. Alright, so what other interesting things do you see about my road bike? Well, what is this? That's a suspension fork, right? So what is this? That's essentially a suspension saddle. Why am I using these two things? Well, sometimes I venture off-road by a wood path or something like that, but that's not the core issue here. You see, weight has inertia, which means that weight doesn't want to change the way it's moving. So if you are riding on your bike and you are hitting some sort of a rough spot, railroad tracks, square bumps, what have you, you are going to get hammered by your weight much more than an average person, which means that you probably want to have a suspension fork to separate you from the ground a bit more so your wrists don't suffer, and you want a suspension saddle in order to separate your spine from the same thing. Now, experience and suffering caused by not having it taught me that if I ride with a rigid fork on this kind of bike with this concrete hard tires, because 90 psi and 32 millimeters is pretty hard, I'm going to end up with busted wrists or busted elbows, one of those, and I have to get some sort of treatment for this. It's quite painful. And I know that from an experiment where I substituted my usual approach, which is having a suspension fork with a rigid one, and I was riding that religiously for about 6 months, and after that I had to simply visit the doctor and I would be getting some sort of injections in order to alleviate the inflammation. Now, the suspension seat here, that's a new development, but essentially the same principle. As you are riding hunched over your bike, as the rear wheel hits something, it's going to hit you by transferring all that force to your spine. So, having this little bit of trouble, that's not much, that's, I don't know, 2 centimeters, something like that. That gives you enough separation to avoid suffering. Alright, that was mostly about road bikes, so what about mountain bikes? Well, let me use my Fritz as an example. Obviously some things still apply. You will be wearing your tires faster, you will be using a lower gearing, although mountain bikes are usually geared quite low, and unlike on the road, no one's going to be looking weird at you if you're riding 28 tooth front chainring and a 50 in the back. However, what are differences from mainstream mountain biking when you are considering a bike for a heavier person? This is a freeride fork. This is an X Fusion Metric, a big burly piece of kit. What is it doing here? Am I some sort of Josh Bender impersonator? No, I'm not. I am actually quite mellow in my riding. However, this fork is here because this bike is a dual 180mm suspension, and I had chosen it precisely because as a heavier rider I benefit from having more suspension than usual, either by mechanical suspension like here, or by having thicker tires, or a combination thereof. Essentially the same reason as on the road, but even more pronounced. Because you are heavier, even if you are doing all the body English on a bike, even if you are heavier, you are going to get hammered through the terrain much more, so you want to have a little bit more of suspension. Now, this bike is a bit of an extreme example, but I have chosen it specifically because of its long travel. Alright, this is going to be a bit more pertinent here than on a road bike, but still applies. That's a 226mm rotor. Why is it here? Well, because I'm heavy. Essentially, a brake converts your kinetic energy into heat and stops you. The bigger the rotor, the faster it is capable of doing that. So obviously you want to have as big of a rotor as humanly can. Now, this is a 6-piston brake. Now, I don't know whether this somewhat translates into more braking force. However, I like to believe that it does, at least it looks the part. But once again, it shows the principle. You want to have big brakes, big rotor and big brake, at least on the front. Now, this is kind of painful on road bikes because they come stock with 160 or 140mm front rotor, and this is something you should avoid. You want to have big rotor on the front because that's something that's essentially responsible for your safety. On my road bike I have 180 on the front, and it is so small only because the fork can't take anything more. I would like 203 or even bigger. You already know that using a downhill brake on a road bike isn't really all that much of an issue, but if you're heavier it is an issue that you can't do it. Anyhow, on a mountain bike you want to have a big brake, big rotor, lots of suspension to take the hammering you're going to put it through. Now there are some technical problems, or one very specific technical problem which is going to get annoying the heavier you get. Let me show you. Alright, let's presuppose that you want to have a full suspension bike. You want to take a look at the leverage ratio of your frame, because the lower the leverage ratio, the more likely you are going to be able to use a shock that's available off the shelf without some sort of an issue. For example, this frame has 180 mm of travel and 76 mm of a shock stroke. That's its average ratio of 2.5 or something like that. Point being, I am using a 450 pound spring here, and that's sufficient for me. However, average rider would use something like 300 on this, and I think that springs of this for this kind of a shock and approximately 650 pounds of hardness, which isn't really all that much if you are very heavy. Now, consider there are people who are much heavier than I am. The point being is that the lower is the leverage ratio of your bike, the more likely it is that you're going to be able to find a shock that fits, especially a coil shock. Now, air shocks are a little bit more flexible, but they also have maximum pressure you can push into them, and if you're going to exceed it, then you are, well, risking an explosion. And once again, the same principle applies. The lower the leverage ratio, the less pressure you will be needing to use. Alright, there's one more thing to consider when considering a mountain bike, is that all the recommendations for pressure you're going to find on the internet are completely irrelevant, because the pressure, at least on the rear wheel, has to be more or less proportional to your weight. Now, I weigh approximately 100 kilograms, and while most of people I ride with sometimes or meet on the trail would ride something like 20-25 psi on the back and 20-25 on the front, usually more on the back than on the front, I've been using 40 psi on the back and 30 on the front for quite some time, because I don't like to shred my tires, and because I am heavier, I am obviously causing much more deflection. Essentially the same rule as it comes to suspension. You need to pump it more to have more support. Alright, that would be what I have to say about the subject, or at least what I remember I wanted to say about the subject, because this topic has been marinating in me for some time now, as you can imagine. And obviously I might have forgotten something and I'm going to remember it later, but those are my experiences. I hope you enjoyed this video or have got some informative out of it. If I have some sort of addition to it, I'm obviously going to share it. And in the nutshell, pump your tires to appropriate pressures, get something comfy when it comes to handlebars and seats, and get big brakes, and you're most likely going to be fine, and the conditioning is going to take care of the rest. So, thank you for your undivided attention, and I hope to see you on the next video.